Good afternoon. My name is Charmaine Nelson, and I'm a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement, and the Director of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery at NSCAD University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I founded the Institute in 2020 as a way to support the traditional scholars and also artists who are working in the underserved research field of Canadian slavery. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for tuning in. One of the mechanisms that we use at the Institute to support this research is to provide fellowships to very worthy scholars and artists. And it's such a privilege and a pleasure to be able to host Chris Gismondi today. So before I get to introducing Chris, I will first do a land acknowledgement. Then I will provide Chris's bio, and then we'll go into a talk that will probably go for a maximum of about 15 minutes. And if you can hold your questions for the end, but what you can do so you don't forget them is please type them into the Q&A, and I will moderate at the end of Chris's talk so that we'll have a rich, hopefully, discussion and Q&A period. But we'll let Chris get totally through the presentation, and then we'll introduce those questions for Chris at the end. All right, so land acknowledgements, as many of you, especially if you're in Canada, know, can become quite meaningless when they become performative, and that's something I absolutely do not want to do. It's deeply problematic that they often become more about looking like you're doing something than any real commitment to redress and repair, which is absolutely necessary, especially in a colonial context like the nation of Canada. So NSCAD University is in Mi'kmaq on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wet'suwet'en or Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wet'suwet'en or Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Furthermore, these treaties were signed within a context of a genocidal European imperialism and colonialism, which sought to oppress, to control, and to contain Indigenous peoples across the Americas, and which resulted in the expropriation of 12 million Black Africans who were enslaved across the same territories and in Europe. Indigenous and Black peoples, therefore, in various places like New France, which we today know as the province of Quebec, and in Ile Royale, which we today know as Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Black and Indigenous people were enslaved together within transatlantic slavery, and in their shared bondage and resistance became kin. These shared histories have motivated me to make one of our 4 mandate areas at the Institute the overlooked study of Black Indigenous relations within the context of Canadian and transatlantic slavery. So before I introduce Chris, I'll just say that the next Fellows Talk, which I also hope you tune in for, will be featuring Artist in Residence Fellow Titian Wright, and that is April 20th of this year at 12 p.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. So April 20th, and please tune in live because that one will not be recorded. Now to introduce Chris. So Chris, who goes by the pronouns he and they, is a queer white settler, first generation Canadian of Scottish and Italian descent, born and raised on Dish with One Spoon, head of the Lake Treaty number 14, 1806 territory. Chris is a PhD candidate at the University of New Brunswick, completing his doctoral project under my supervision, lucky me, and I say that with I absolutely mean that. Chris is a wonderful student, a wonderful person to work with. Chris's doctoral and master's work have been supported both by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada grants, and Chris serves on the advisory board for the Institute of the Study of Canadian Slavery. His curatorial work has spanned institutions like La Guilde, the Leonard and Binna Ellen Art Gallery at Concordia University, and the Government of Ontario Art Collection. Alongside me and an undergrad seminar that I taught at McGill in 2020, Chris contributed to the grassroots report, which we published, which was entitled Slavery and McGill University Bicentenary Recommendations, and 3 other public-facing projects. Chris's writing has been published in Canadian Art, the Canadian Art Review, the English Historical Review, Essay, Art and Opinions, Peripheral Review, and Arcadia Environment and Society. So I'll hand it over to you now, Chris. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And let me just get this all queued up from the start. Hopefully that all looks good. Okay, so excellent. Thank you for having me again. And as always, it's wonderful to have this opportunity. So thank you. It's also always humbling to try to share these stories and to uplift these people and also critique what they endured. And a content warning for this talk, I am using the language from the archive, both the Canadian and sort of British archival sites, but also as sites that have repressed their slaving histories. I think it's important to uncover and also discuss that language and its usage where we have pretended it doesn't exist, but also that by the nature of slavery, there is going to be some discussion of sexual and physical violence by the nature of women's experiences and slavery as a whole. And lastly, thank you for listening and tuning in. It's really important that we try to get this work out there and disseminate this material. And thank you for the Institute for your support this past winter as a research fellow. So, scholars of transatlantic slavery piece together lives of enslaved subjects from biased, derogatory, and incomplete fragments in the archive. For understudied sites like Upper Canada, or what is currently Ontario, the archive comes with additional challenges from a minority enslaved population. Here, I'm also presenting documents from one of my sites of comparison, the British Isles, with a shared suppressed slavery history, temperate climate, and enslaved minority population, and how this is recalled in the archive. My inquiry of the archive is rooted around the Black female experience, gradual abolition, and family preservation in Upper Canada and the American North. But Canada and Britain, until recently, had evaded scrutiny for their practice of transatlantic slavery, and one document, a fugitive slave advertisements, have become a sought-after and useful source on both sides of the Atlantic. Britain's empire has occupied a big place in slavery scholarship, but its domestic practice within the metropole has been suppressed. So much like Cole Thrush's Indigenous History of London, this comparison is also about partially understanding slavery within Britain, as many Loyalists and other settlers came to or back to North America via Britain. Upper Canada and Britain are also minority enslaved sites, have a northern temperate and regimes of sort of mixed skilled and domestic labor. So far for Upper Canada, that emphasis seems to be homestead agriculture. In Britain, it looks like a sort of skilled trades, sailors and blacksmiths and things like that. So fugitive slave advertisements record enslaved or bound labor in places where it had been suppressed, but also document the resistance to slavery in moments like gradual abolition through the strategy of flight. So my doctoral exploration of the Ontario Slave Archive so far has helped to illuminate the ways that slave-owning society of Upper Canada was like, and how we can sort of attempt a social history for the enslaved populations and begin to tell those stories as best we can. And to just start us off, here are 2 landscape paintings on birch bark from the Lieutenant Governor's wife, Elizabeth Simcoe. And they're sort of a really strange appropriation of Indigenous material and the European picturesque. And this amalgamation of material and transplanting is sort of an apt metaphor for thinking about slavery's expansion, colonialism, and the sort of creolization or acculturation for Turtle Island and the Black diaspora and this sort of history as a whole. So Upper Canada is a uniquely tricky site, and I think that has impeded the secondary research on it to date. The Great Lakes Peninsula that you can see there on the map was ceded from the French Empire after the 7 Years' War. And from 1763, it was regulated as part of the province of Quebec before being separated administratively in 1791 into Upper and Lower Canada. The influx of Loyalists from the American Revolution meant British settlers were relocating their lives and homes, enslaved property, and different regional experiences of slavery. The province's first capital was Newark, the administrative hub of the new enclave from 1792 to 96, which is about modern day Niagara on the Lake, after which it was moved to York for the naval security of the Toronto Islands, modern day Toronto. The territory would see further conflict with the War of 1812 and the burning of the capital. And what I mean to demonstrate with this summary is that the region's white settler slave society was turbulent in its political stability. Civil and political life was interrupted by war, relocations, and administrative shuffling. So here is just a little bit of a map of that Great Lakes Peninsula, Upper Canada, now sort of Southern Ontario, and a sort of military sketch painting of the Niagara Falls and sort of early people moving through that region as well. So without belaboring the point too much, but the documents from the Archive of Slavery are very unkind and violent. They fragment, criminalize, amputate, brutalize, and objectify subjects as commodities and properties. Navigating this, I draw from scholars like Jacques Derrida, Sadea Hartman, and Marissa J. Fuentes. The glimpses of slavery are a stark contrast to the full fawns and collections of the settler slaving families. So here, for example, is a family tree from the Jessup fawns, which dates back to 1649 in its retelling of the family. And included in the Chrysler family fawns is a material from the physical body, a lock of hair that accompanied a love correspondence. So while the fawns of the property elite themselves are not full repositories, documents like these would be extremely unlikely, if not impossible, to find or have been produced for enslaved or free Blacks in a minority temperate space. As someone working on families, familial structure, and relationships of mixed free or freed and enslaved status, a family tree for a bound family is refused by the archive created from enslavers. As well, while relationships were formed, tested, and persevered through transatlantic slavery, we are largely left to recuperate these affections from the shadows of fragments rather than lovers' scripts and keepsakes. And so in this presentation, I'm presenting archival documents, fugitive slave advertisements, but also trying to sort of eventually build on the goal of a social history of slavery. And there's many scholars who have inspired me so far. My interest in women and families is a part of that pursuit of a social history of slavery, rather than a top-down institutional or legal history of slavery in northern sites. Something the scholar Shane White critiqued as failing to see slavery and how it was experienced by the enslaved. So thinking of scholars like Sophie White, Trevor Bernard, and Gunvar Simonson and Afua Cooper, who have built upon the concept of slave testimony extracted from these flawed sources. Jenny Shaw and Andrew Hunter have brilliantly tried to reclaim the biography genre from the white, propertied, and elite of history. And lastly, the fugitive slave advertisement has been expanded as a form of narrative and portrait, theorized from Maureen Elgersman and Charmaine A. Nelson. And despite these archival sources, we can attempt this goal at a bottom-up or a social understanding of the history of slavery. So instead, the archive of slavery and early Black subjects looks startlingly like this. This is the reverse side of a bill of sale for a so-called Negro woman titled "For My Wench Blank." And as a sort of ironic and aptly poetic symbol of the larger archive of slavery, the woman is not named in the legal text. And here, where I would imagine a first name might be, it has been refused from the distress of the document. And while we cannot recuperate the woman's name and whether it might have been chosen or enforced, a source of pride or embarrassment for her, we can still begin to try to uncover her story as best we can. The other document here, which I'll speak about more later, is from my most recent visit to the archive. And I want to point out what looks like an annotation dated from 1880. And the note reads, "Historical, preserve this." For me, this is the epitome of the luck of the archive, but also at what loss have Northern record collections been purged and miscatalogued, unprepared for these histories. While many documents and sources remain, what are the happenstance and circumstances that delivered these documents to collections for preservation, and what others won't be seen again? I was thankful that this collector, or assumedly a family member recognized the significance of this document, but surely others whose judgment and perceptions of themselves have been clouded from inaccurate national histories might not have been so courteous. And my last sort of contextual piece of information before diving into documents is about the gradual abolition that was passed in 1793, which primarily piqued my interest in the region. A new Heritage Minute has recently celebrated Chloe Cooley, the enslaved woman who was bound and sold across the Niagara River to New York by Adam Vrooman. Her screams reverberated through history, and as Lieutenant Governor Simcoe writes, disturbed the public peace. The law to limit slavery was then narrowly passed by the slave-owning government majority of Upper Canada, and within it, a gradual abolition that saw women's reproduction as part of the slow decline of slavery in the region. The law stipulated that enslaved people born before 1793 would remain enslaved for life. However, children to enslaved mothers would serve indentures until the age of 25, after which they would be free, having had their most productive years of labor taken from them. This law sparked my interest in enslaved women and families, a complexity shared by other temperate sites with gradual abolition, like Pennsylvania in 1780 and New York in 1799. This opportunity for continued extraction, along with the frontier demand for diverse labor needs, might explain this rental ad for Chloe by Robert Franklin, advertising here to quote, "a gentleman willing to purchase or employ her by the year or month." On this page as well is Sue, who evaded capture for a few weeks from James Clark Sr., the settlement sheriff, in a brave escape. Females are currently overrepresented in the print culture and documents of Upper Canada as I have found them, with sale, purchase inquiries, runaways, bills of sale. And while men were more likely specialized and sort of skilled in their labor, the diverse nature of female labor for newly acquired settlements seems to be in high demand and interchangeable with country work, sustenance farming, animal husbandry, cooking, cleaning, laundering, food preservation, soap, and candle making, all necessary skills to isolated new settlements. So Chloe's catalyst for Canada's only gradual abolition, the rental of an enslaved female, and Sue's runaway all prompt how these documents can be used as flashpoints of their existences and struggles, and starting points to dissect and rebuild their lives, hardships, joys, and values. And brilliant scholars of Canadian and Northern slavery have resisted the narrative that violence does not end with a small scale. Slavery in the North came with its own unique challenges, like extreme social isolation, a lack of Black community, and a hostile white majority population, and a climate which, coupled with strategic material deprivation, was near fatal. For enslaved women in the outposts, forts, and trading posts of Upper Canada, of the alcohol-soaked male frontier. What would enslaved labor and motherhood look like in isolation without community? The preacher Sojourner Truth, born to the Dutch estate in New York, recalled in her narrative that her family lived in the cellar of a hotel with cold, damp mud floors, contributing to their poor health. This artifact, the lashing ring, was spiked into a tree and used for individual corporal punishment and group spectacle to enforce submission. It's believed to have belonged to Matthew Elliott, who recreated a plantation in southwestern Ontario with as many as 50 to 60 enslaved people. And in my comprehensive exams, I thought about this material a lot, as sort of the quotidian or everyday violence of it. It looks like it could also be a horse hitch or a tent spike, some sort of military issue implement, but instead it was sort of passed down to us and we assume used for this corporal punishment sort of way. And a comparison I've drawn is to the lynch mob using a rope in a tree. So thinking about the nebulous nature of Northern slavery, but also the sort of nebulous nature of punishment in the absence of a sort of fixed plantation regime or apparatus. And then similarly here, from the London Journal, this fugitive slave ad denotes Peter Joyner fleeing Jekyll's ship and discloses his description as middle-aged, pretty tall, square-shouldered, slender waist, broad forehead, thin-jawed with irregular teeth, one of his 4 teeth beaten out. So Peter is one of many enslaved subjects in the British fugitive slave ads who are marked, scarred, branded, collared, maimed, and injured, pointing to the physical violence of temperate Northern slavery. As well, for the British context, we can ask questions like, where might Peter flee to? Will he try to seek refuge among free Blacks and be fearful of the many surrogates often listed in the British fugitive slave ads, like traders, pub keepers, coffee houses, ship captains, merchants, and other pro-slavery advocates? And just to further fugitive slave ads and their use as documents, by a means of comparison, here are two runaway ads for white indentured servants. Both are from the Kingston Gazette. The apprentice boy, Francis Adams, is described as 17 years of age, light hair, light eyes, and fair complexion. The servant, Catherine Deming, is 15 years of age, dark brown hair, swarthy complexion, and sullen countenance. Had on when she went away a blue checkered handkerchief and a blue woolen frock. These descriptions read much like the detailed fugitive slave advertisements of other Canadian sites like Montreal or Halifax, with the added caveats of white complexion and the full name of the subject. Here's a British ad that sort of also gives great detail. Here, Dick is described as a mulatto manservant with a drab coat and waistcoat, buckskin breeches, bushy hair, good English, and an engaging address. He's described as a good manservant, 5 feet 8 inches tall, 28 years old, and some smallpox markings. However, as you might have seen from my examples so far, the fugitive slave advertisements from Upper Canada refuse to represent freedom seekers as humans and also demarcate them as objectified slaves in very vague racial detail. They deny offering the rich visual descriptions of dress, behavior, temperament, bodily scars, language, biographical detail, and labor skills commonly found in the genre. While these omissions are frustrating for scholars, they are a curious feature for advertisements whose sole purpose was to be translated into visual descriptions for capturing the enslaved runaway. These advertisements for temperate, white majority spaces call on citizens to reinforce white supremacy and help apprehend the fugitive property despite the gaps of published detail. So how do we make sense of advertisements with nothing more than a name and a vague racial descriptor? Is it possible that the small insular Loyalist outpost communities of Upper Canada were intimately connected, or were the enslaved as racial others already under regimes of scrutiny in these white towns? So for example, here, Thomas Butler offers no description for his, quote, Negro manservant Tom, apart from that marker of identity, objectification, and vague labor description. Cuff Williams in the Canada Constellation is plainly described as a Black man and an articled servant to me. And some British ads are also sparse in their detail compared to their counterparts. Here, the enslaved woman Phoebe of Mrs. Grant in London's Cavendish Square is simply described as a Black wench. These descriptions are frustratingly sparse, and this omission or the lack of need to divulge detail speaks to the racial makeup of these spaces and the operations of civility. As Hannah Wasler writes, fugitive slave advertisements are situated in contexts of what she called a shared belief, often recognizable in syntax, where unspoken assumptions are shared by the author or slave owner and the reader, the temporary slave catcher. In place of descriptions about the enslaved, Upper Canada print culture, like other archives of slavery, reveal more about the enslavers, their desires, and the institutions that held people in bondage rather than those who endured it. And about this discrepancy between enslavers' productions of documents and enslaved peoples whose histories are beneath the surface, I want to introduce a new subject in my research, Esther. So at Fort Detroit, while in British North American hands, Captain Byrd here legally records his ownership of a captive prisoner, Esther, after a raid with the help of Indigenous allies. The witness is Alexander McGee, an Indian agent, and continues that Byrd sold Esther and her male child to a William Lee as payment for clearing his land. This affidavit implies and records a number of things between the lines. Firstly, that conflict and colonial war were tumultuous moments for the enslaved to be raided, captured, and traded as spoils, particularly here shortly after during the American Revolutionary Wars. Secondly, Byrd assumes ownership and formally legalizes that ownership of Esther in text. Thirdly, the presence of her son, not mentioned previously, should raise suspicions on the father, particularly during war and the fur trade military outpost of British Detroit. And lastly, how Esther and her son are used as currency twice here, once as treasures from the raid, and secondly, as payment for William Lee's work on the 16 acres of land. And I'll return to the cooperation of Indian allies and the complexities of race and settler slavery and the Black diaspora of Turtle Island. But here, Esther's moment of recognition records turmoil, instability, and precarity of enslaved womanhood in the colonial frontier and shifting empires. Esther's capture and bondage as an enslaved woman, like other women in this presentation, points to the domestic, sexual, and comfort work that elevated slave owners in the homosocial space of war and frontier and enriched their professional lives. And the scholar Walter Johnson explored the slave markets of New Orleans through family correspondence, interpersonal family and business relations of the white slave-owning classes. In it, he describes that slave purchases became security for families and future generations, particularly white women. In the Upper Canada Slave Archive, the inheritance of enslaved people is being examined as one batch of evidence. Here, the military leader, John Butler, passes to his grandson and granddaughter, each an enslaved child. However, he stipulates, quote, until the said Negro arrives to the year that the law directs to receive his freedom and to remain her property until discharged from her service as the law directs. Interpreting this, these enslaved children, George and Jane, are either very young, a maximum of 3 years old, and we can get questions like where and who is their mother, or is John Butler seeing the writing on the wall of slavery and cushioning his will with the possibility of a future forced emancipation? However, wills have not yet proved a very prolific source for me. The early abolition date, as is exemplary here, hindered or just disturbed the usual transfer of enslaved property between generations. As well, the necessity that enslaved subjects outlived their owners was unlikely given the squalor of early settlers and the harsh climate of early towns. For example, the white slave-owning Loyalists camped at Fort Niagara in tents. And a question I had is, what conditions were their enslaved help subjected to and continued to endure? And inspired by Sophie White's work on creolization, acculturation, and assimilation in the Pays d'en Haut, material scraps, wills, and inventories offer glimpses into the material conditions of 18th century life. This will from Hannah Jarvis was produced after the Connecticut slave owners fled the Patriots in London, but before they reappear in Newark and York as slave owners. More research has to be done to see if British slave owners brought their servants to the mother country and passed them on through wills like in the colonies. So this is her probate will from 1785 before she reappears in North America. But she does pass on material treasures to be spread to her family: money, snuff boxes, letter seals in luxurious materials of mother of pearl, crystal, and silver. So I'm going to return to the Jarvis family as British North American slave owners, but also remain hopeful to continue to interrogate the personal archives of British enslavers. And wills and newspaper print culture are one resource, as are notarized bills of sale, saved mostly in family fond collections. Here is the text side of that bill of sale I showed earlier for the unnamed Negro wench, and records her sale for £65 New York currency. However, the sale appears to have taken place in New Hampshire shortly after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. Daniel Klaus was a known slave owner in Upper Canada, and we can ask questions like, was this unnamed bound woman living long enough to be forcefully brought to Canada? Klaus would not have been the only loyalist to expand settler slavery and forcibly relocate his enslaved property from overland or marine routes around the Great Lakes. Also noteworthy about Klaus was that he was an Indian agent. Himself and other men in my research, which I hope to explore more, are examples of a white settler slavery. How did these men position themselves, exercising colonialism and negotiating land dispossession in their careers, and retiring to homesteads maintained by enslaved Black labor? These men are examples of the professionalism that Northern slavery produced, analyzed by Joanne Pope Mellish. Indian agents like Alexander McGee, John Johnson, Butler, Klaus, Baby, Clement, or Chrysler, who enacted the colonial project, require further examination for their two-pronged oppression through settler slaving and white supremacy. And even before the towns were established, military forts and trade camps like Niagara were a place where slavery was recorded and practiced. Tia Miles has brilliantly illuminated the slaving of Indigenous and African descendants at Fort Detroit as it changed from French to British to American hands. Fort Niagara was the site of a mutiny in 1730, and an enslaved Indigenous man known only as Charles was captured and exported to Martinique. Here, Adam Chrysler navigates the shifting frontier, purchasing an enslaved girl, Sarah, from Samuel Street and Thomas Butler. For 40 pounds New York currency, she is described as a woman at just 9 years old. The document reads, quote, "Know all men by these present that the said Street and Butler, for and in consideration of 40 pounds of New York currency, I in hand sold the receipt of, had bargained and sold by this presented to, bargained and confirmed to Adam Chrysler, his heirs and assigns, a Negro wench named Sarah, about 9 years old, to have and to hold against our heirs and assigns, and against all person or persons ever do warrant and forever, in have and hold sale at Niagara this 5th day of November, 1786, in the presence of," and then signed the witnesses and Butler. The business transaction of these military officers and soon to be settlers is preserved before the enclave was even founded. The transaction, of course, is the ownership of the child Sarah. And from here, we may ask how Street and Butler acquired Sarah. Was she a child being separated from one of the many slaves that Butler already had? Or was she taken during a raid or newly arrived from the American settlements? This so-called purchase may hint at the sort of labor roles that Chrysler wanted filled, someone to tend to the home and raise the comforts of the outpost. Insights like these undervalue the nationalistic myths of settlement and who laid the foundations, particularly for the political, business, and military elite in our history, who are sometimes wearing all three of those hats. And Indigenous servitude in English colonies like New England, South Carolina, and the Caribbean are known to have practiced at times of war or conquest, most notably the Pequot War in 1636, King Philip's War in 1675, and South Carolina until 1720. Practices of Indigenous slavery in New France and Canada are well documented by historians under both the French and the British. The British in Canada inherited a practice of Indigenous slavery from New France, legally categorized as pani or panis, alongside slaves of African descent, documented by scholars like Marcel Trudel and Tia Miles. Afro-Indigenous slaves are also commonly appear in fugitive slave ads from spaces like New York and Pennsylvania. Here, Charles Field describes my Indian servant Sal, who flees Niagara, and Charles Field, I learned from other advertisements, is a tavern owner in Niagara. Very strangely is the Scottish runaway ad for a North American, quote, Indian lad called Bob in Edinburgh. Bob flees in 1764, 65, and 66, with ads of pursuit being published in Edinburgh and Glasgow. His description describes him as disliking shoes, sometimes speaking tolerable English, good French, and sometimes with pierced ears. Bob is likely indigenous to North America, unlike others in the British database of East Indies, Indian, Bangladeshi, or Indonesian origin. The time frame also puts Bob as a likely spoil from the 7 Years' War and a resistant figure to his life of service far removed from Turtle Island. The other side of this coin is the presence of Indigenous nations participating in slave raids and the trading of Black chattel like Esther. Particularly during the American Revolutionary Wars, nations allied with England were documented attacking Patriot properties and bringing back African slaves, distributing them amongst themselves and British military. Sophia Pooley in 1851 at the age of 90 recorded her testimony of being kidnapped from New York and her enslaved family, brought to Canada by white traders and sold to Joseph Brant, who is currently the only known Indigenous leader in what is currently Canada that practiced chattel slavery that we can name. And for anyone with further interest in that, I highly recommend Andrew Hunter's book on Sophia as an excellent in-depth exploration. But the historian Tia Miles is guiding me through my thinking here that she says Native America is, quote, a significant location of the Black diaspora that many slavery studies overlook. She concludes that Indigenous leaders and mixed Euro-Indian descendants adopted private property and anti-Black racism in the form of chattel as a tool of legitimacy and power. And while enslavers document themselves, they also give us glimpses into the enslaved that operated within their world. One such man is Peter Russell, the second Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, and he was a prolific slave owner during the transfer of the capital from Newark to York. He is regarded as being quite brazen with his slave ownership of Peggy and her children Jupiter, Amy, and Millie. Her partner is believed to have been the free Black man named Pompadour. Russell records Peggy and his slave ownership in both correspondence and print culture. In 1801, Russell writes to the plantation enslaver Matthew Elliott about Peggy. She has recently been in prison for punishment, and by the end of October 1801, Matthew Elliott returns word that Captain Joseph Brant, the Mohawk leader, will take Peggy away or return the bill of sale. By January 1802, Matthew Elliott is writing that he will compensate Russell for any losses. He says, quote, "I do humbly engage myself to indemnify you for the value of the wench. I have every reason to suppose the matter has been settled by Captain Brant long ago." From this exchange, Russell was insistent to dispose of Peggy with haste and no regard for her children and partner. Indeed, Brant's estate in Burlington Bay or the Grand River would have geographically distanced her from her family in York, particularly at a time when inland road infrastructure had not yet been constructed. After these exchanges, Peggy is first recorded as running away in 1803, likely a petit marronage to be with her family. Russell follows this up with an ad for the sale of Peggy and her son Jupiter. He notes in the ad euphemistically, they are both of them servants for life. Russell is willing to sell Peggy apart from Jupiter, as well as break up the larger family, in a cruel but usual occurrence under slavery. The elite of York thought this display in the newspaper was a bit brazen, gauche, and distasteful, as some scholars have cited, but regardless, it appeared that slavery persisted in York and elsewhere in Upper Canada, but in maybe a typical Canadian fashion, there was a reluctance to be confronted by it. So from this thread, Peggy remains the most documented woman in my research, and her story of family and motherhood remained just below the surface of these enslavers' texts. And returning back to the Jarvis family, this is a truly remarkable artifact. So William and Hannah Jarvis, as I mentioned, were Connecticut Loyalists who spend time in England after the Revolution breaks out and reappear as slave owners in Upper Canada. The Jarvises had enslaved 6 or 7 people, and one of them was Henry Lewis, who runs away sometime before he writes this letter back to his former owners. So in it, he writes from Schenectady, New York, and he says, "Sir, my desire to support myself as a free man and enjoy all the benefits which may result from me being free in a country where a Black man, in defense by the laws as much as white man, is induced me to make you an offer of purchasing myself. I am a Black man and am not so able to pay all the money down which you may ask for me, but upon these conditions I will purchase myself £10 this year and every year. After £16 until the whole sum is paid in a significant manner, I beg you, what you would be so kind as to purchase myself and at a lower rate than any other favor. My master I also wish for and beg, I shall always remember on account of your great kindness to me, free man, your affectionate servant, Henry Lewis." And this is really such an exceptional document for all of the happenstance that makes it exist, his literacy, his success in escape, and his bravery to write back to his former owners. But also, as Harvey Amani Whitfield pointed out when I presented this document a couple weeks ago, what does freedom mean, especially in a lot of northern spaces? The critique of freedom is that little was sort of done to improve the standard of living outside of slavery. But here, freedom means something very important to Henry Lewis, and his experiences with the Jarvises require much more examination and analysis. And this is quite a remarkable set of documents as well. So this is the fugitive slave advertisement for Bet and her young son, and the date of the advertisement is quite late at 1818. She is fleeing R11s from Belleville, and given that the gradual abolition passed in 1793, we can interpret that Bet was born after the law and she's fleeing the end of her indenture, and her son would then be born free. However, the second scenario is more likely and has been confirmed to be true by Natasha Henry's research. So Bet was an enslaved woman, and it appears that she's fleeing here her life under slavery and taking her son, who would be indentured, with her. This ad ran in the Kingston Gazette for 3 or 4 weeks, suggesting that she was somewhat successful. There's a bill of sale preserved in the Walbridge family papers here that reports her being 25 in the year 1812, putting her birth around 1787 and well before the gradual abolition. Her infant son Tom was indentured, being born after the law has passed. From Henry's research, we know that Bet and Tom were likely apprehended. There's an assignment of sale in March 1824, owned by Eli Keller, for the apprenticeship of, quote, a young mulatto boy, Tom. The ownership of Bet and the transfer of Tom's service is documented changing hands about 3 or 4 times each. And so with this language of Tom being mulatto or mixed Euro-African as well, we can add questions around who is the father. A follow-up to this and the initial fugitive slave advertisement would be why was she running and what had precipitated that decision. Bet and other enslaved women across transatlantic history share the archival silences of unnamed fathers. And in full transparency, the paper document of the bill of sale sort of brought me to tears when I was looking at it a few weeks ago. It had not yet been microfilmed. And so I was sort of holding this piece of paper and thinking about the room that it shared with Bet and Tom during such a sort of humiliating and degrading transaction. And that really lingered with me. And sometimes that sort of darkness or that empathy hits you as a researcher or as a student of this field. And so on sort of these unnamed mothers, William Renwick Riddell, writing on Upper Canada, highlighted in a footnote 2 baptisms that record a filia and filius populi, a daughter or son of the world, not claimed by the father. So those records referred to the baptism of a, quote, mulatto girl Peggy in 1800 and a son John, born, quote, of a Negro girl baptized in 1807. So these two records demonstrate that, like Bet and Tom, the sexual predations of slavery and the offspring of interracial procreative sex existed in Upper Canada slavery, just like other sites. And until more is uncovered about these families and their navigations of slavery, for now their presence in the archive complexifies how we understand gradual abolition and slavery from the lens of motherhood and family. And one last slide here, fugitive slave advertisements, wills, and other documents record glimpses into slavery in the social history. But I wanted to end here on sale advertisements. So like bills of sale, these document the enslaved as commodities. And much like Bet and Tom or Esther and Sarah, they remind us that slavery was about labor, gaps in labor markets, and the regimes of different sites that needed to be filled, particularly when free whites were unavailable or unwilling in northern labor, which was also not designated as slave labor, unlike sort of plantation work, late plantation work and other tropical or semi-tropical regimes. So here we have Prince who's fleeing in Bristol and an unnamed Negro woman in York, Upper Canada, who is noted that she can cook, launder, dress poultry, and do women's hair. So just considering sort of the proliferation of women in the Upper Canada Slavery Archive, the skilled men of Northern slavery, and the sort of mixed and various labor roles that they filled in both the colonies and the metropole as unfree people. Labor that benefited the empires, colonies, and enslavers, as well as their livelihoods and offspring being commodities too. So this has sort of been a little bit of an exploration of various aspects of my research, bringing in comparison Britain as an understudied site with various labor and demographic similarities. So thank you for your engagement, and I look forward to questions and discussion. So thank you, merci, grazie, tap the leven deal.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'll just remind the audience, if anyone has questions for Chris, please type them into the Q&A and I can relay them to Chris on your behalf. So Chris, brilliant work as usual. Okay, there's so much there. Really rich archival work too. Congratulations on going forward with that. Okay, so can you just contextualize for us a little bit more
Mhm.
how you came to focus on and why you want to focus on Upper Canada. Is that a personal decision in terms of your family history, for instance, and how you came to focus on Britain? So is that because you see the connections of the enslaver families between those two regions, or how did that come about?
Yeah, so for Upper Canada, I am born and raised in sort of the GTA Southern Ontario area. So it's an area I'm familiar with. And then doing undergraduate work with you and talking about slavery in Canada. There's so Canadian slavery is sort of its own understudied field, and then within Canadian slavery, in the scholarship, there's a lot of emphasis on the Maritimes and New France and Quebec, which is great. But so I sort of recognized that Upper Canada was a bit of a blind spot. And then learning about it and reading about this gradual abolition, I just sort of saw alarm bells ringing about what that meant for women and what that meant for families to be implicated in that process. And then Pennsylvania did it first, New York and others followed after. And I think that it's just sort of often been like written out or left unexamined about what that meant for these families, especially to have someone in your family who's enslaved, someone who's free, someone who's indentured. How do you navigate that? How do you hold that together? And then for Britain, thinking about the comparisons and sort of the national histories, suppressing and erasing that history of slavery, but as well the Loyalists having connections, some leaving the US, the American colonies, going to Britain and then reappearing in Upper Canada, some of them administrators and military leaders, definitely having those connections, maintaining those connections. And then also thinking, like I said, about the labor and the demographic similarities. What does it mean when you don't have like slave labor, like in Jamaica or South Carolina, and you just have sort of like maybe indentured people or poor whites or wage workers or enslaved people all sort of doing various roles. And then Upper Canada and Britain both sort of thinking about them as enslaved minority spaces and thinking about the vagueness in the fugitive slave ads sometimes. And what does it mean if you feel like you don't have to describe someone who you're trying to recapture is, yeah, sort of something I'm still working through.
Right. That's a very dramatic distinction that you're pointing out between the ads that you're recuperating in Upper Canada and, for instance, even the ads in Quebec under the British or in Nova Scotia. They look remarkably different. Oh, so okay, so Quebec and Nova Scotia have some really obvious similarities because they're both Atlantic or proximate to the Atlantic. What are you uncovering about the nature of enslaver behavior and or enslaved labor that's distinct or maybe not because you're dealing with the Great Lakes region? So you still have the water, but it's not the Atlantic. So is there something jumping out at you? Because for instance, in Quebec, then there's an ad for an enslaved Black man described as, I think, a Negro slave sailor, right? And he's sitting in, I think, Quebec City or Montreal, and you have all of these West Indian merchants like James McGill who are trading with the Caribbean. Are you seeing any of this still? Is it not there because it's Great Lakes region? What is it looking like in terms of labor?
Yeah, so Upper Canada also sort of being like removed from that maritime network. It still has access to it, but it's sort of slightly removed. So I think I sort of see that in two ways. One is this emphasis that I'm seeing on enslaved women and that domestic role for what I imagine and know to be very, very isolated outposts and towns, to have someone to raise that comfort, raise the garden, preserve the food, butcher the animals, all of that would have been really, really noteworthy. So there were like connections from Montreal and Albany that sort of filtered through the Great Lakes, and Tia Miles talks a lot about that at Detroit. So sort of Detroit, Niagara, York, sort of relying on these deliveries from Montreal and Albany, which would have been seasonal and sort of irregular, but also being quite isolated. So yeah, so sort of like I'm seeing a lot of female labor and thinking about what that means and that's wanted and desired, but also thinking about, yeah, so there is still a connection, and Tia Miles talks about it a lot as being connected to the military and the fur trade. So those industries that are very used to navigating this sort of Great Lakes watershed, and we haven't really thought about the fur trade and the military as part of the Black diaspora and slavery, but I think that they really have to be a part of that. And we have to talk about that because those are sort of the Europeans moving through that space.
Fantastic, thanks. Emily Davidson has a question. Emily.
Yeah, one of the things that I was resonating with in your talk was the kind of the way that you're characterizing the various activities of loyalists. And I'm doing some research now on loyalist activity or like white loyalist activity in New Brunswick. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that like depending on where they're relocating from, they're bringing different ideas about slavery with them. And so I just wondered if you could expand a bit on what you mentioned. You were talking about one enslaver who, I think what you kind of, your turn of phrase was like they recreated this plantation. And I just wondered if you could flesh that out a little bit more for us and talk about like any differences that you're seeing based on kind of what their previous experiences of enslaved majority sites might have been versus if they were relocating from a like northern space after the American Revolutionary War.
Yeah, so I don't have specifics. I can't think of their names, but one of the things that really jumped out to me when looking at these loyalists is some of them are coming from Virginia, some of them are coming from upstate New York, some of them are coming from Connecticut. So they all have very, very different experiences of labor and that economy and what slavery looks like. So Matthew Elliott is the one who is sort of accredited with recreating this plantation, I think in Amherstburg. And he is actually a military fur trader, Indian agent, sort of frontier man. And I'm reading a biography of him that I'm getting through at the moment. And he had acquired all of these enslaved people on raids to the Kentucky territory during the American Revolution. So he wasn't sort of necessarily transplanted from the sort of South or like Middle South up, but like definitely had an idea in mind about his life and how he would make money. But there were other people coming from Virginia and various places. And then, yeah, like you were mentioning, there's people who come from sort of more like the family slavery north, Connecticut, New England, New York, New Jersey, who are maybe used to seeing one or two enslaved people living with you. And so that's something that also stuck out with me about the Loyalists is just they expand slavery, but the slavery that they expand doesn't have a single, it doesn't look the same. And it's quite drastic in the way it looks and the way it functions.
Thank you for that response. I'm going to take you back to the beginning of your talk when you showed us the lock of hair from the Chrysler fawns. All right, so what do you have me thinking about there, Chris, is of course, people who study slavery and study race and racism in the context of colonialism, we know that the fabrication of this fiction of race first starts with complexion, then second is hair. So I'm thinking about, you know, people like White and White and other people have written about the way that white enslavers and white society at large mobilized derogatory stereotypes of black hair as wool, often forced enslaved Black people to refer to their own hair as wool, and turned it into a site of specifically really refined punishment and torture, especially white female enslavers inflicting head shaving on enslaved Black women, who they found to be blunt, very sexually attractive to their white husbands. And so they would punish them. We know that's been well documented by head shaving to the scalp, sometimes for life. So I'm thinking that contrast between here, this white family is preserving this lock of hair as a symbol of love, of a physical body, of touch, of contact. And then we've also inherited in the same archives, often not the hair, but descriptions of the violence targeted at the hair of Black people. Can you help me think about this and what's going on there? And thinking through, this bodily site of hair and how it's made manifest then in memory in the archive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of brought it up because it's just this anomaly of like, you would never find, it's very, very unlikely that you would find maybe black or like kinky textured hair in the archive saved in this way. And yeah, what you're talking about, the ways we do see it is like those head shaving punishments, or I think Dick's Fugitive Slave ad describes him as having bushy hair. Sometimes they use the term wool as well. So even thinking about just the corporality and where the descriptions come in and how they're used. And as well as someone who's like interested in material culture and art, something about the fugitive slave advertisements that are really disappointing to me is that they don't have those descriptions. How did Bet style her hair? How did Peggy style her hair? What did they look like? What did they choose to, what time did they choose to carve out of their week or their day to present themselves? And we don't have that from those descriptions, which is unfortunate. And we do have those from other descriptions. So sort of maybe trying to extrapolate, but yeah, hair is a site of sort of racial fixation and punishment, but then also white hair and portraits. I didn't even get into the slave owning portraits, but all of that beauty and aesthetics of whiteness. There's sort of a lot to unpack there about dress and punishment and desirability.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that you're not finding descriptions of Black male or female enslaved hair in the fugitive or sale ads of Upper Canada. Really?
None.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is fascinating because Quebec ads, as you probably know, have several descriptions of Black male enslaved hair. And my last go through have no descriptions of Black female enslaved hair, but of head wear like bonnets, no African head wrapping or anything like that for the females. One example of head wrapping for males and head shaving and wig wearing. So it's interesting, like can we begin to piece together there's something going on in Canada where enslavers are not describing female hair, right? Because this is not, this is now two provinces where it's just not there. So that's really fascinating, Chris. Okay, so, and again, if people have questions and comments, please type them in the chat, but I have a lot for Chris, so I'll keep going. So Chris, in terms of the slave sale documents, you're talking about how they, further work to anonymize or objectify the enslaved. You gave the example of the Negro woman and her child, for instance, and that's all you get, right? So heaven help us in trying to recuperate who she actually was, who this child actually was, etc. But I'm wondering, are you finding any kinds of resistance to that stark objectification that is also somehow in the archive and perhaps visible? Where you see any level of pushback in the insistence on naming and the insistence of humanization that's coming from the enslaved or from the Black community that's showing up in the archive?
Yeah, so unfortunately not yet. And more work is going to be needed there. But yeah, I like with the fugitive slave ads and the slave sale ads, it's just really sort of startling that they just offer one racial descriptor, Negro, mulatto, sometimes even just wench. I think Matthew Elliott, Peter Russell, who I was talking about in his correspondence with Matthew Elliott and Joseph Brandt, sometimes doesn't even refer to Peggy by name, just says the wench, and everyone knows who he's talking about, which is so derogatory and terrible. But yeah, and not even in, I haven't seen it in the Upper Canada ads. I've seen a few in British ads where they'll be like, my servant Jane sometimes goes by Catherine. So sort of sometimes in the British ads, I've seen that insistence that they probably have another name or a past life that they're trying to hang on to. I haven't seen that yet in Upper Canada. But I will also point out too, so Jenny Shaw, one of the scholars I hinted at the beginning, has done some really, really brilliant work on a woman whose name I forget, but wrote a biography of this woman of color in early England and just pulled out a full biography and family history from the archive. So even if it's not in the archive, that we can get those names and stories, it's definitely there. We just have to keep digging to put everything back together.
And that
so
author,
yeah,
sorry,
I'll just,
the author's name
Shaw.
again? Jenny Shaw. And do you remember the name? Is the book? Is it a book?
It's an article.
Okay.
I can find out the name and I'll pop it in the chat or something.
Thank you so much. Or you can send to me and I can send it to the people who get our newsletter or something like that. That would be wonderful. Thank you, Chris.
I have it here. In the name of the mother, the story of Susanna Mingo, a woman of color in the early English Atlantic. and I can put that citation in the chat, but highly, highly recommend. And just, yeah, because we talk about so many silences, and she's recreated this entire woman's history and family and legacy.
Which is so rare. And Mingo being the last name of this woman. Okay, that stand out too, because Mingo was commonly used as a term for just an enslaved person in the British context. So that's probably not accidental there too. Okay, so back to this is inquiry into like the objectification. I'm wondering then, Henry Lewis seems to be extraordinary in that, and this might be the moment where it's like, I am me, I'm a human, here I am, I want my freedom, I want it legalized. Okay, so not that you've been able to dig further into him, but can you start to think through what would we need to do next? Where would you look next to try to piece together what became of him? What was that context around him that would provoke him to out himself and say, here, I'm over here in New York State. I mean, obviously, is it the Jarvises he was writing back to, right? Might have responded by, let's go get him and drag him back into slavery. So what is that context? If you can explain to all this, why is he risking that? And then how would we find him again? Where would we start to look to potentially find Henry again? What type of archival document, what type of context?
Yeah, so absolutely. And so I guess sort of the next steps for uncovering him might be a little road trip to upstate New York. And maybe we see him in like a burial records. Maybe we see him alive and hopefully not criminal or court records. The other thing that's unlikely and unfortunate that you and I have talked about free Blacks with gradual abolition is just there's a possibility that once you're free, you just sort of disappear off the archival record, because it's very unlikely that you're going to accrue enough wealth to leave any sort of record, and you're no longer the property of someone who's going to record you.
Right. Are you buying land as a free Black in this 18th century, right? Do you have enough money to buy a horse, right?
Do you have any possessions to make a will? Do you? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, but I mean, there's definitely ways that you can go about trying to find them.
I love thinking out loud with you. Maybe baptismal record, maybe marriage record, right? So yeah. Besides, what can we think about outside of incarceration, right? Inside of conflict with the law. Yeah. But Henry is fascinating. And of course, I've heard you speak on this before, but it just jumps out at me that he's like, it's your wife. Your wife is the one who was making my life hell in that household, right? And that he points that out. And I think that really, we have to really reconsider the role of female enslavers and as not, the conscience of the plantation, the conscience of the household, etc. But in that case, certainly in many, many others, they were the opposite, right?
Yeah. And so just to provide a bit of a counterpoint, I've also thought a lot about how I think very deliberate and careful Henry Lewis is. And so like I've read that passage where he's saying that Hannah Jarvis is the one who vexed me and that's why I'm running away. And so we can sort of take that at face value, or is he also sort of playing up to William Jarvis's strengths to try to get him to be sympathetic? And so I love that letter, but I also sort of don't know at what level to read it, what's true, what's...
For sure. This is a great point. The other thing too is, okay, what is the extent that you're going to find favor with the husband for insulting his wife? So if it's not true, why go there? If she's not the abusive one in the household, why even say it? Because if he loves her, that's not gonna help you with him, right? So then that makes me wonder about their marriage. So if he's telling the truth and he thinks it's going to help him with the Mr. Jarvis, why would that help him with Mr. Jarvis? What did he observe in their relationship where Mr. Jarvis would be like, yeah, my wife is a beast, like, right? Like, I mean, seriously. And then just to follow up there, let's a little bit more. Any correspondence between the Jarvises as a married couple that would answer questions like that? Like what's going on between them and their household as a couple and as enslavers?
Yeah, that's a great point. I haven't looked into their correspondence together. I think unlike some of the other couples, I don't know if they actually spent quite a lot of time apart. Other people were like I have to be in London, I have to be at the outpost, I have to go off to war. I don't think that was maybe the situation for William and Hannah, but it's definitely possible that there's something there to look into. But just on this topic, while going through the newspapers, and it makes me think of that brilliant article about Jan Kurth and the enslaved women and the runaway wives from upstate New York. I have a little collection of runaway wives and sort of back and forths in the Upper Canada newspapers, which are just such a fun drama to read, but also give insight into like, if this is what white life is like and it's miserable and terrible, I just always sort of think to like, what was it like for everyone else below that? To endure and run away. And
okay, keep collecting those. That's your second book. Okay. All right. Just a suggestion. Okay. Another question. All right. So when you mention a Negro man, so the Black man named Peter, that, and such a difficult representation of the physical brutality he'd suffered, right? So his teeth, his front teeth beaten out, I think, or something like that. What was so striking to me there, Chris, is that phrase juxtaposed with a little bit later, it said something like the slave owner saying that Peter will be kindly received if he's brought back something. Okay, so this brings me back to, again, you know where I'm going probably. It really messes with my head and really angers me. These notions of politeness and genteel society and Southern hospitality that are circulating amongst white people for white people at the same time that they're brutalizing the people they're enslaving. And then it's so starkly printed in that ad, right? So here's Peter. I'm not unafraid to say that someone, maybe me, beat his front teeth out, and I will kindly receive him from white person to white person when you bring him back to re-enslave him. Can you talk through, do you have any thoughts on the nature of white sociality, if you will, or social relations in the context of the brutality of slavery?
Yeah, absolutely. And the British fugitive slave ads are really interesting because, like Upper Canada, where sort of a domestic practice has been suppressed, the ads are, there's many, and they're not shy about the branding, the beating, the collaring, all sorts of sort of corporal punishments, and about sort of what this looks like for the white surrogates and slave owners talking to each other. I mentioned it very briefly, but something that I really want to explore with, I think, this chapter and this part of the research is many of these British fugitive slave ads in particular mention the slave owner themselves, maybe a business surrogate, a tavern they frequent, a Jamaica coffee house down the street that they are on good terms with. And so I was just thinking that there's this whole network of surrogates in these spaces like London or Bristol. And I'm sort of like thinking about where could you go for safety when there's such a wide sort of net of pro-slavery sympathizers. And especially you're talking about Southern hospitality or sort of white Caribbean gentility, but here we are in London, in Britain, and we have to think about this net of slave sympathizers and pro-slavery people that you have to maneuver around.
Right. And in the same way too, when I think about, okay, who's aiding the enslaved people? Okay, who's aiding them because they're actually anti-slavery in sentiment, and whose aid is for sale? You have enough money, I'll help you forge the pass. You don't, I'm gonna, I just as soon turn you in and get the money for your fugitive ad, right? So how are enslaved people navigating that too, when some allies need to be put in quotes? And then how do we recuperate that, of course, when allyship was illegal? So who's going to write down that they aided the enslaved person? Like, most people will never write that down because it's illegal, right? Because you're aiding someone like an enslaved person who's guilty of self-theft, right? Yeah.
Which brings me back to, we talked about this a few weeks ago with Henry Lewis's letter, but even calling on Joseph Yates, the mayor of Schenectady, I think is so absolutely ballsy and brave for Henry Lewis, but as well what it means for the mayor of this town to be implicated as a potential accomplice. Yeah,
fantastic. Okay, so I have a couple more for you before we let you go. It's so great to talk to you about your important work, Chris. So, all right, in terms of archival practice and cataloging, All right. So are there other ways to access the bills of sale for enslaved people in Upper Canada outside of the family funds? Because I want to point out to everybody, of course, this is a problem if there's not, because it means you have to know which families or individuals were enslaving to get to the documents on specific enslaved individuals. Whereas, just to point out to everybody, my experience in working in the province of Quebec is that the bills of sale for enslaved people are actually archived specific to the notary who drew it up. So you can actually search on the basis of what keywords appear in the bill of sale. Any bill of sale, like you put house, or you could put horse, or you could put, what I had to do when I was searching was put the horrible colonial terms like mulatto, Negro, slave, etc. And then I got all these hits, but they led me to reels of microfilm that were attached to the specific name of a notary. So what you're describing is not that. Is there a workaround for us as scholars trying to find this material?
Yeah, so right now I'm not sure, but as I spoke about a few weeks ago and as I've talked about with you, so yeah, the family fonds are really the way I'm navigating the Archive of Ontario. I've been trying to get to Library Archives Canada, which might have the catalogs and collections be a bit different. But yeah, the family fonds are a bit of a tricky situation because you have to know that a family had enslaved people to even go and look for them and see what's there. Because as I mentioned, I found probate records. I haven't found the notary records yet, but the probate records are sort of organized by family surname, and the span is like 1785 to 1899. So it's just absolutely huge. I have to check back with notary records, but documents like bills of sale have seemed to be mostly preserved in the family fonds. And I just want to point out that that bill of sale for Bet and Tom that Natasha Henry found wasn't in the seller or the buyer's family fonds. It was in Elias Walbridge, who is the witness to that transaction. And so it's just pure happenstance that it was saved. And as I pointed out, that someone in the family saw value to it and decided to keep it. So it's in the Elias Walbridge fonds. He's a witness to that transaction. And it's nothing sort of short of a miracle. But yeah, some more work needs to be done finding the notary records for Upper Canada, and hopefully they'll be easier for the next person.
For sure. And so this of course is pointing out what we're up against as scholars doing this work in terms of the disorganization of the archives. And part of that too is that of course they'll become more organized in a sense, or at least people like you and me will leave a trail of what we found, where we found it, how we found it. But since there's so few of us doing the research, we go in blind often looking for these documents, and you can see that there's a difficulty in whether, I mean, who's going to look at the witness? Who would, even if you knew the witness's name, that's not where we'd think to look. Right. So that is really tremendous that Natasha Henry was able to come up with that. Okay, so how about we end this way? Can you paint a picture for us? What is the image you were developing thus far on what child enslavement looked like in Upper Canada, and what Black enslaved or mixed families, enslaved and free, enslaved and indentured families look like in Upper Canada? Okay. What is the picture you're starting to develop of those two things?
Yeah, so on childhood.
Yeah, and just so you know, why I'm asking that too is just really struck me. You showed us that sale ad for the 9-year-old girl Sarah by herself, and you said like, where's her mother? Where's her father? Like, so what is, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So on childhood, I mean, as we've talked about, sort of, if you're an enslaved child, there is no childhood. Like when you can walk, you can work. And on a farm, on a domestic in a domestic setting, there's always sort of work to do that would change with the seasons. So someone like Sarah, or even George and Jane, who are passed to Thomas Butler's grandkids, it's sort of really unsure what that looks like, but I can imagine that it's a quite laborious childhood. I think even for like children of those families to help out with their chores, but to also have an enslaved counterpart doing more work for less food, for less comfort, for all of those sorts of things. And then as well, thinking about Bet and Tom. So Bet's enslaved, her son Tom is indentured, but each of them are sort of transferred 3 or 4 times each. And from what I understand of Natasha Henry's research with them, they seem to have sort of stayed in the same area, but are they living together? How is she caring for Tom? Is she worrying about Tom? Are they even in the same town? So sort of like they're tied by family, but it's unsure sort of what that family looks like on a day-to-day basis, because they're each their labor. Well, for Bet, it's her labor and her livelihood. For Tom, it's his labor and I guess his livelihood until he's 25, but each of them are sort of owned separately in that sense. So that's sort of also talking to with the mixed statusness about that precarity of family and the way that people were navigating that. And then Peggy is the other interesting figure, I think, to go to there. So her partner Pompadour, from my understanding so far, is that Peter Russell employed him on the estate. But does that mean that him and Peggy are able to see each other? Can Pompadour stay in the residence? Does he even want to stay in the residence? Does Peggy leave the times when she's running away to go be with Pompadour? We sort of don't know. But it's also interesting that Pompadour is sort of still in Peter Russell's employment network and sort of atmosphere.
Wow. Okay, so thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for your brilliant discussion and answers to the questions, and for your wonderful research. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak, and it's a real privilege and honor to be supervising your wonderful and important work and to see it unfolding. So thank you today for being with us today, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in. And we've recorded this wonderful talk, so it will live on the Institute website. And I hope that people will come back to future events as well. And Chris, do you have, is there anything you want to tell them about, anything else coming up for you?
I don't really have anything else coming up. I just wanted to say thank you for your support and all your guidance over the years. And it's always a privilege and a joy speaking and continuing to learn with you. And I'm so happy that this platform exists and that you're building it.
Thank you, Chris. That's wonderful. Thanks. So thank you everyone for being with us and sharing your afternoon with us. And hopefully we'll see you on April 20th for Artists in Residence Fellow Titian Rights Talk. Thanks a lot. Bye. So if you can hold a second, Chris, and Will, can you just stop the recording? And then we can say goodbye to Chris. Chris, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you, Emily, if she's
no
still
problem.
Here. Thanks, Will. And so I'll be in touch soon, okay? That was great research. Every time you speak on this, my head just spins. Seriously, there's so much you're doing and so much you're collecting. It's excellent. Do you feel good about everything?
Yeah, no, I feel great. I'm really excited I'm leaving for Wales next week and just really excited to be in one place, sit at my desk and write the first chapter, just really start hammering away.
Oh, amazing. Okay, so you're going to travel soon?
Yeah.
Okay, so safe flight, okay? Did you check all the COVID? You checked all the COVID stuff?
Yeah, for England, there isn't, for the UK, there isn't much anymore, but
you don't need a test to fly in?
No.
Oh my gosh, the USA now, they changed the test to 24 hours. It's not 3 days.
For the US?
Yeah, can you imagine? Oh my gosh, yeah. Someone's making a killing on this. That's all I have to say. Someone's making a lot of money. But you be safe because all the variants are going around, right? So be safe, right?
Will do, yes.
Okay.
You as well.
Okay, and be in touch, okay?
Absolutely.
Take care. Okay, thanks, Chris. Bye.